Right. Good evening to all, and welcome to this week's Wednesdays with Wayne webinar series installment, Unpacked Crafting a Law School Personal Statement. My name is Justin Williams. For those who are uninitiated, I am the Associate Director of Admissions and Diversity Recruitment here at Wayne State University Law School, located in beautiful Midtown Detroit. So the reason we're doing this session is because the personal statement is the one aspect of the application that appears to be shrouded in the most mystery for potential law school applicants. There are a lot of questions that surround it, a lot of unknowns and discomfort with the law school personal statement. So hopefully after this conversation, you have a better handle on it and at least some understanding of how it's used in the process and how you can use it to really make a good case for yourself, the law schools you choose to apply to. So let's take a step back here, 50,000 foot view, and just talk about the process overall. For those of you who are not new to these webinars, some of this you'll have heard before, but I think it's important in framing the conversation around the personal statement to put it in its proper context as it relates to the application overall. So what are the things that law schools are looking for in that application process? I think the first thing that law schools are trying to assess when reviewing an applicant is the likelihood of success in their academic environment and their preparedness to compete with the kinds of students that that law school admits and regularly matriculates. And so that is best assessed by measuring academic ability and performance using the metrics that we have come to rely upon as law schools based on reams of data that at least have some correlation to outcomes in the law school space. And so those metrics most commonly are your performance on the law school admission test or LSAT, and then your performance in undergrad or your undergraduate GPA. Letters of recommendation can also fit into that puzzle, but the primary factors are your performance in undergrad and your performance on the LSAT. Now, your performance in undergrad is that production piece. So what have you done in a classroom setting over a sustained period of time? How have you performed and acquitted yourself in that space? Are there trends in performance? Are there things that demonstrate that you have the ability to maybe rebound, right? If you had some challenges or you've been consistently good across the board. The LSAT is really more of a performance or potential measure, right? So trying to figure out the skills that this test is testing, how do you compare to your peers in this school or in this applicant group, right? In that test group, rather. And then how does that sort of fit into the narrative of what we're trying to build as an institution, right? What does this signal to us about your likelihood to be successful just based on what we know about students with similar profiles? So that is really the crux of that first question. The second question is really about what you bring to the table beyond those academic accomplishments, right? What do we get as a law school for the benefit of this bargain other than somebody who's going to come in and be a good student? And the pieces that we use to really assess that are ones that you know and understand: your personal statement, which we'll talk about at length here today, your resume, letters of recommendation to another extent, and then addendum, right? Or addenda, as it were, pieces that help us get some context out of this deal. And then also the last piece of this puzzle, which is less about you as an applicant per se, right, and more about the goals that we've set for ourselves as an institution, is really this you versus everybody piece, right? So your application is up against the applicant pool itself, and then it's also up against institutional goals and priorities. And so sometimes you could be a really strong applicant who just for whatever reason, it's a really competitive applicant pool, or the timing of the application isn't ideal, or you're just in a position where your profile doesn't align properly with the goals that we've set for ourselves as an institution. And so the decision may not be favorable to an extent based on that. But you aren't here for the big picture stuff. You're here for the very specific picture stuff, which is the pieces that relate to that second question the personality, accomplishments, character, and fit, right? Specifically the resume, rather the personal statement is the core component of that. So we'll dig a little bit more into the factors, right? Sort of how you can present these things, mostly because when I start talking about the personal statement, I get questions about resumes, I get questions about letters of recommendation, right? All of these supplemental pieces, because they're the ones you have the most control over in the process, right? And so I think that the desire there is to make them as close to perfect as possible. So this will just be like some biographical data about these pieces. So the personal statement obviously is a core component of that second question, right? And helps the school assess personality, accomplishments, character, and fit. Typically the tone or format of the personal statement is narrative, right? You are telling a story or communicating a story about yourself to that committee. I think length is open for discussion depending on where you apply. Most schools give some guidance as to what appropriate length is. For Wayne, I think most people are able to get the job done, as it were, in 2 pages. We do see personal statements that are longer than that. I think if I were to say, hey, you might be veering into too much land, it's if you're into 4 or 5 pages, right? Unless you have a lot to say and there's a sort of a story there that's going to wrap and give us some insight we couldn't get, I would encourage you to think very clearly about making it 2 pages, be succinct, concise, and clear in what you're trying to communicate. And I think the content of that should be as positive as it can be. I will talk a little bit more about that because I know what the question will be related to the positive piece of it, and we will absolutely talk about it. I think that diversity can come up in a personal statement. There are other places where it can come up as well, so don't feel obligated to write it there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But I think the last thing that I'm going to mention about the personal statement, but I believe is probably the paramount consideration and priority, I guess, as it were, in this process, is writing ability, right? I mean, this is, before all else, an opportunity for you to demonstrate that you have the ability to write cogent, coherent prose, right, as it were, or a story, right, and really be able to communicate clearly and effectively with the written word. So I think the other piece that fits into that personality, accomplishments, character, and fit bucket would be letters of recommendation. I get questions about sources for those, right? What makes a good one? Who are the right people, right? And I generally offer this guidance specifically for students who are thinking about Wayne. So depending on when you've graduated from undergrad, right, completed your studies, I think that professors or others who can comment on your intellectual abilities and academic performance are probably a good call. And that's for those of you who are closer to undergrad, right? So if you're 2 years or so out from undergrad or less out from undergrad, I think you need to prioritize finding faculty or professors who can speak to who you are as a student and what it's like to have you in the classroom. Inevitably, there are those of you who are applying after taking some time away from undergrad, right? Or you've had a professional career and are considering this as sort of a second step. So employers are absolutely appropriate source for that. Just anybody who's in a position to write you a strong letter of recommendation, I believe is a good fit for this process. And that's usually the appropriate way to frame the request for the letter of recommendation, is to say, hey, can you write me a strong letter of recommendation? It provides an opportunity for you to find out, right, whether or not somebody can do that. And it also gives your theoretical letter writer an opportunity to say, hey, maybe I'm not the right person for this. You should consider somebody else, and save you some time and energy and make sure that you get the kinds of letters that would be a worthwhile complement to your application overall. And then, there are any addenda that you might submit as a part of this process. They typically show up in some contexts where maybe there are some character and fitness concerns, right? So you answer in the positive to the questions in the application related to character and fitness. You would submit an addendum that explains that, right? That gives them some context around what your positive answer, why you answered in the positive, right? And what happened in that situation and where things stand. And then there's also room to share contextual information about potential red flags that may come up in the application. So we'll talk about addenda a little bit further along in this conversation, but I just wanted to make sure that we sort of had some table setting for this piece of the process in general. So what is a personal statement, right? Let's break it down to its very base sort of elements, right? The first piece, and I talked about this, is really a professional writing piece, right? It's an opportunity for you to demonstrate to the admissions committee your ability to write and communicate effectively. The written word is a lawyer's primary tool, right? And so I think that having a grasp on basic foundational writing concepts is important. I encourage students to think about this mostly as that professional writing piece, right? And to treat it with that level of seriousness as you go through the process. You should be sourcing people to edit that and review your personal statement to ensure that the writing is solid and is a good reflection of your writing ability. It's also a supporting document in the application process, right? So it's not like the core document, it's a supporting piece of a much larger puzzle that tells the story of you to the committee. And it's also an opportunity for you to introduce the admissions committee to aspects of who you are that they can't get from other areas in the application. Right? So that's really the story there. And so how do law schools use personal statements to make admissions decisions? How does that work? Where does that influence come in? And again, it's really that context piece, that what's the value of having you in the classroom beyond your ability to be a good student and really contribute academically. We want to get to know the people who are going to be in our building, right? Who are you? What are you about? Who are you and why are you here, right? I think are the two central questions that if you can answer those, if you can come away from your personal statement and say, I've answered those two questions, right? Then it's probably a good reflection of you and a really good opportunity or way that you've told your story that could benefit you in the law school application process. So let's talk a little bit about what the personal statement can actually do, right? I mean, I think that's sort of the core question. I think one of the things that it can do is it can make a strong application a stronger application, right? So if all of the other pieces of the application are in order, right? If you've got a competitive GPA and a competitive LSAT score, if you've got a solid resume, right, that tells the story of what you're passionate about outside the classroom and what you've been invested in terms of your time and energy. If you've got letters of recommendation that speak highly of you as an individual and a person, and offer the opportunity for somebody who knows what you're after to really make a strong case for you, right? Then I think the personal statement is a worthwhile and a strong complement to that in that process. Like we talked about earlier, it also provides the admissions committee with insights that they can't get from the other aspects of the application. So what I usually advise people is don't treat this part of the application as an opportunity to sort of retell the things that we already know. If you're a great student, it's not necessary for you to tell us, right, in your personal statement, how good of a student you are, because that will show up in your performance in undergrad and in your grades, right? If you've had these professional experiences, simply recounting those professional experiences in the personal statement, is simply just retelling your resume, right? Now, there's room, I think, to talk about things that you've done outside the classroom if they've helped influence the choice that you've made to pursue law school, or in some way, shape, or form have guided you down this path, but simply just sort of chronologically telling us again the things that you did in the personal statement, just a retelling of your resume, and doesn't necessarily help you, right? So I think the most important thing to think about it as is an opportunity for you to tell that committee things that they do not know about you and can't get if they don't read this personal statement from the balance of the application. I think the other thing that it can do is present you as prepared, thoughtful, and diligent in your approach, right? So you want to make sure that this document reflects your level of professionalism. Like I shared before, it is a professional writing piece, a professional writing exercise. So having it proofread, not doing strange things with margins, right, or fonts, and making that strong professional presentation of yourself, I think is important. It demonstrates your ability to reason, make connections, and tell a story, right? So what is there a theme with your personal statement that you carry throughout that, sort of helps the committee understand what they're reading and why they're reading it, right? Are you able to make connections? Can you go from, this point A to this point C to this point D, or this point A to this point B to this point C to this point D, and really help the committee understand what they're reading and why they're reading it and why it's so important for them to know this about you, right? And I think that's another way or another piece that articulates what it can do. And then it also, as a writer, establishes that you're prepared to come in and write the way lawyers write, or at least you possess the foundation, right, to become a competent legal writer. Much of what you know about writing could be deconstructed in your first year of law school. But if you've got a strong foundation of writing, it makes it easier for you to translate those existing skills to legal writing. And I think the personal statement is the committee's introduction to you as a writer. In many cases, admissions committees have faculty on them who are really the ones who, who are looking at that personal statement to say, can this person write, right? Is this somebody that, if I'm a legal research and writing professor, is this somebody that I know can come in and do the work that I'm going to ask them to do and not encounter struggles that would make it hard for them to navigate this course and really become a competent and effective legal writer, right? So that's the other piece, in terms of things that it can do. Now, what can't the personal statement do? I think that's another great question, right? I don't think students ask it this way. I think they ask, does it do these things? And I have to tell them no. But I think the fundamental truth is that it's not a universal solvent, right? And that a strong personal statement does not usually overcome a bad overall application. It's not a single piece on which an admissions decision can rest, right? So if the rest of the application isn't up to snuff, but you've got a rock star personal statement, it's not going to be the kind of thing that the committee is going to say, well, I'll just dismiss all the rest of this data or information that doesn't give me confidence in, say, I'm going to admit this person solely on the strength of their personal statement. Now, what I will say is that a personal statement might keep you in a conversation, right? If you are a marginal applicant, right? So not somebody who is clearly not a good fit for this law school, just based on what you know about, what their class profiles have looked like and are expected to look like for the cycle in which you apply, but somebody who maybe doesn't fit the mold neatly, right? But has some ability, right? And has demonstrated in the process, some academic ability and a strong performance, or at least a competitive performance on the LSAT. And maybe it's just not a shoe-in, right? That the answer would be yes. I think a strong personal statement can signal to the committee, okay, all these things considered, maybe we aren't in a position to admit this person straight away. Maybe we got to waitlist them because we love this person, we love their story, we love what they can bring to the table. And we hope that if, things change with the applicant pool, we'd be in a position to extend them an offer of admission, right? And so I think that's another way that the personal statement can be helpful, right? And keep you in the conversation. But again, it is not a universal solvent. If the rest of the application is not particularly good, a strong personal statement may not overcome that and put you in a position for the kinds of outcomes in the process that you are looking for and seeking. All right, so I guess the next piece of this puzzle is the what do I write about question, which, I get, again, relatively infrequently, or relatively frequently in this process. I think the answer to that is deeply personal, right? I think that, there are some things to consider in the process, but the personal statement is the one opportunity that you will get in this process to share with the committee something about you that is uniquely you, right? It's your story to tell and your place to tell it. So this is the story all about how, a little Fresh Prince reference. I might be aging myself a little bit with that. But I think these are the things to think about. This is the story that you're telling. My advice to people, the first piece of it is to follow the prompts, right? Many law schools will have a prompt that they want you to respond to as a part of the process of preparing that personal statement. If you have that prompt, follow it, do what it asks you to do. Now, in typical Fresh Prince fashion, right? Personalize it. Feel free to sort of play within those boundaries, right, that they've established for you. Put your own personal spin on it. Tell your story the way you want to tell it. But make sure you follow those prompts if you have them. The next question is, well, what if you don't? I advise students to think about maybe 2 or 3 things that the committee absolutely has to know about you to make an informed choice as to your fit for their law school, right? So if they don't know these things about you, then they could not, would not, should not, right, be in a position to make an informed decision about whether or not you are a good fit for their law school and in a position to come in and contribute in ways that are uniquely you. So let's see, the next piece of this, and I think one of the things that I get, again, relatively infrequently is, how do I talk about things in my life maybe that aren't easy or good things to talk about, right? Life hasn't been easy, right? I've had a hard life. How do I tell that story? And I think this goes back to my earlier point, right, about the content of the statement being positive, right? I think there are ways for you to tell the story of your life, right, if it's got some challenges that end in ways that signal to the committee that you've overcome those challenges, or those challenges have been fuel to you to really take this next step forward, or that experience is informing your decision to pursue legal education, right? I think that is probably the advice that I would give people, is to be honest but positive about what's happened in your life, right? So who did you become as a result of, the things that were not particularly easy in your life, or the challenges that you have had to overcome to get to where you are, right? Not everybody has had a path that is even and paved for them. There are some rocks and some challenges that you've had to navigate to get to the place that you're in, and it's a part of the story and you want to tell it. But I think that if you, as long as you frame it as and here's what I've gained from it, or here's why this is important to me, here's why this, particular thing, is driving my decision to go to law school, or because of this, I want to take this next step professionally and personally, so that it doesn't happen to other people. Or there's lots of different ways to really tell that story. So I think you should frame it that way, right? Try to be honest, but also positive about what's happened to you and who you've become as a result. So negative stories absolutely come up, I think, in the same vein, right, as life has been hard. I think if, there was a negative singular experience, right, that is shaping your choice to pursue this, if there's a negative, sort of instance or opportunity or challenge, right, a very particular singular sort of thing that's happened in your life that's driving this decision and fueling your passion to become a lawyer and take on the cause of justice, then I think you should go about the business of telling that story, right, and pursuing that and really putting that out there. I don't think that it's off limits. I think that there is a such thing as too much negative, right? And you want to make sure that you're getting to the place in that personal statement where you are telling us giving us the hook, right? So what's the hook here? Why are we doing this? What's the story? What is this about? And I think that's the thing to move forward with, right? Is that if that story is negative, all right, well, what did I gain from this? How is it informing your current decision making? How is it driving you in the direction of going toward law school? But what's taboo though, Justin? Like, what's off the table? What are the things that you shouldn't talk about? I don't tell people what they should not talk about, right? I think there are things to think about when considering what you write. I think you have to consider the audience that is reviewing your application. You do not know the backgrounds of the people on the committee who are viewing your application, right? And so if this, if you're taking a tack on a subject that can invite controversy in either direction, right? So politics, religion, social issues, right? If you're in those spaces and part of your personal statement touches on those things or sort of gets into your positions on those subjects and things, just be aware that somebody on the committee could be reading that who sees it differently, right? And that is not to suggest that the decision on your application would be, negative as a result of that, and that the marketplace for ideas would be, shrunk, right, by the difference of opinion. But, I do think that you have to be conscious of the fact that somebody could see it differently, right? So just be thoughtful about that piece of it as you're going through the process. And again, if it's a negative thing, right, then, I think that, it's about the how it's told and how it's shared, and less about the what. I think the other piece, I guess the thing to think about is the question I get pretty frequently is how personal is too personal? And my advice is similar to what you'll hear about an area of law, a very particular thing in the law. And I think the answer is you'll know it when you see it, right? If you're writing your personal statement and you have to ask yourself, is this going too far? You're probably close enough to the line, right, of too personal to maybe pull it back a little bit, right, and make it a little less personal in the process, so that you're not giving up too much information and making maybe the reader feel some things that maybe you didn't intend for them to feel as a part of the personal statement review process. So those are just thoughts about the what that you're writing. So I talked about earlier, there were a couple of things that I would get back to in terms of, additional pieces of documentation that you might submit as a part of the application itself. And so I'm going to start with the addenda, right? So I talked about those earlier. What is an addendum and when should I write one? I think the contexts in which you write one are typically when there is something about the application that would make somebody go, when they read it, right? So let's say you have mixed indicators, or you're a splitter, right? As the kids say. You've got maybe a strong LSAT score and maybe a GPA that isn't great, or vice versa. Maybe you've got a really good GPA and an LSAT score that does not match, what you think others might be looking for, right? Or expect from somebody with your GPA in terms of LSAT performance. I think that's a space where you might want to consider providing an addendum that gives the committee some contextual information about why those things are so different, right? So if you are historically not someone who performs as well on standardized tests and exams, right, then maybe an LSAT addendum that gives some context around that and communicates to the committee that, hey, I don't always test well, but I am a good student, as you can see, based on my GPA, and I'm confident that if given the opportunity, right, I will demonstrate in a law school classroom that same tendency. Or, maybe you weren't a great student, right, and there were some reasons for that, and you've gotten past or over those reasons, and your LSAT score is more reflective, you believe, of your ability to succeed in the law school space. You can submit an addendum that articulates that and tells that story as well. And then I think the other context in which it is important to share an addendum and really mandatory, right, is if you are going through the law school application, and you hit those character and fitness questions, and you answer yes to those questions, then again, you'd want to submit an addendum that explains why, right, you answered yes to that, what happened, what's the situation. So, if you got an MIP in undergrad, right, well, what happened, right, where do things stand with that, what date, the dates and times and all of that sort of biographical data, right, about the event, that important stuff that we should know about as a law school. And the reason that you're asked to do this is really primarily so that when you are in the bar application process, right, so to apply to sit for the bar exam, you are going to have to give them every bit of information about you from an extended period of time, right? And any interactions, any sort of negative things that have happened in your life, right? So if you were ever on academic probation, or if you had any run-ins with the law, right? Any of those sorts of things, you're going to need to supply them very particular and specific information about those things. And that information has to match what is in your law school application, or else you will be called to answer for why that wasn't disclosed. And it is, a reputation piece, a character for truthfulness, right, piece, that you want to avoid any hiccups in the process that can send a signal that you are choosing to not be truthful in this process, right? And so that's a big reason why you want to make sure that you're giving up as much information as you can on the character and fitness side in the law school application process, and make sure that it matches what you would submit to the state bar when that time comes. So those are sort of the reasons, right, why you would want to submit an addendum. But I think the other piece too, and this is on the GPA side, if there's something that's sort of out of whack about your undergraduate performance. So let's say, you were a great student your freshman year, and your junior year, your senior year, and your sophomore year, something happened, right? And the GPA just took a dive. Then that's something where you might want to share what happened, right? What's the story there? What happened? Why did the GPA sort of take a dip at that point in the process? And so that's the other, I guess another scenario, right, in which you would want to submit an addendum that explains a thing that might cause a question mark. I often get questions about diversity statements too, right? When should I write one and why, and then do they help? And I do think that they help, right? If you think of the personal statement as sort of an interview, right, as it were, with the admissions committee, right, when you're telling them things that they just can't get anywhere else, then the diversity statement would sort of serve in a function as a, hey, one more thing though, before we go, I also want you to know this about me, right? And that can show up in a number of different ways. There are lots of different ways for you to sort of present yourself as diverse and unique, right, in the way that you show up in the law school classroom space. Maybe you've got a military background, maybe you're first generation, right? Or maybe you identify as minoritized and diverse in the ways, that are commonly recognized, right? Or maybe it was a hard scrabble upbringing, right? Or there was some aspect of your story that makes you uniquely you, that you feel like should be highlighted separate from the personal statement, right? And I think that these can work for a lot of people because there are things about, the personal statement is precious real estate, right? So you don't want to spend a whole lot of time sort of being biographical, as it were, right? And sort of telling people, hey, here's this about me. Here's, I was born by the river, right? You don't want to necessarily spend a whole lot of time doing that, especially if it's something about you that makes you diverse. And a diversity statement gives you another place to really talk about and tell that story, and then preserves the personal statement for you to try to drive as much impact as you can into the page limits that you have to adhere to as a part of that process. So when should I write one and why? I think if a school accepts a diversity statement and you believe that there are things about you that are unique and diverse, that you should absolutely write that statement. And the reason that you write that statement is because you don't want to leave anything on the table in this process, right? You want to make sure that in the application process, you are saying and communicating everything that you possibly can about yourself to give that committee as much information as they need to really, again, make that informed choice about whether or not you are a good fit for them as an applicant and as a student. So those are just some pieces, specifically the diversity statement in the addenda, that I wanted to touch on before we got into the next part of this conversation this evening. So we're going to get into some questions here next. And before I do that, I know that people sometimes come to these things looking for like the example of the perfect personal statement. Like, tell me exactly what I need to write to get into your law school. And there are two reasons that I'm not as keen on doing that. One, I think consent matters, right? And before I share somebody's, thoughts, right, or their innermost sort of thoughts that show up in this personal statement, I probably need permission to do that. And so it doesn't always work out, right, where you've got the permission to do that. But I also think that the personal statement piece can be really subjective, right? And so, without context around everything with that applicant, somebody writing out a personal statement a very particular way may not work for you, right, in context with your entire application. If it doesn't work, right, I think bad personal statements are bad because people don't come to things like this where they learn about the personal statement, right? They treat it as a throwaway piece and don't take it seriously, right? And so, the way that they show up in the process reflects that. And so it doesn't bode well for them, right, if the personal statement isn't strong. But I think that if you are here and a part of this conversation, it is probably because you are prepared and ready to pursue and put together a personal statement that is a worthy complement to the rest of your application. So I'm going to close my slides here, and then we're going to get into some of the questions that some of you have submitted to me just as a part of the registration process for tonight's session. So getting right into that. So what is the most important aspect of a personal statement is one of the questions that I received as a part of this process. And again, I think the most important aspect of the personal statement is probably the quality of the writing, right? I mean, you want to make sure that you are writing this well, and it is a true reflection of how you function and basically where your skill level is as a writer, as a written communicator. On average, how long should a personal statement be? I think I've touched on that already. I think 2 pages is probably the sweet spot. I think that if you're going higher than that, that you may be in a place where it's no longer as effective. But I think it's also important to remember what the schools that you apply to have set as their boundaries, right? Some schools may invite a longer personal statement, and if you've got more to share in that space, then you absolutely should. What exactly do you look for in a personal statement? I think it's less exact, right, and more in terms of what does the personal statement communicate about you, right? So I think it's less about what we're looking for and more about what we find when we read the personal statement about you. Are you a good writer? Is there a story here? Are you somebody who's bringing something to the class that's different than the rest of the applicant pool? And then how do you frame that out, and how do you tell that story to us as a committee? So when making a personal statement, how do you find a balance in selling yourself and being humble in your personal statement? I think that's a really good question. I think that, ultimately, the balance comes in not necessarily selling yourself, but reminding the committee of why you should be a part of that class, right? So if you know who you are and why you're here, then you're not necessarily selling yourself. You are communicating to the committee that I know who I am and I know why this is important, and I know what makes me unique and special and would really allow me to bring something to this school that is different than what you may already have in it. So how long should the personal statement be? Do you provide a prompt to answer in the personal statement? Again, I think the 2 pages is probably ideal, and we don't have necessarily a prompt in the sense that some other schools might. So you've got a little bit more free reign to write about what matters to you in this process and what you believe that we should know about you as an applicant. Should a personal statement highlight why I would like to go to law school? I think the answer to that is, I think it's not a bad use of the space, right? For you to communicate why you want to go to law school, or at least to reserve some space in the personal statement to help the committee understand why law school is right for you and why it's an appropriate next step. What are your recommendations for crafting a diversity statement? I just touched on those. I think that the most important thing is for you to really understand what the diversity statement is for, right? Again, it's that one other thing kind of opportunity. And I think if you give yourself a page, right, to really communicate what that one other thing about you that is uniquely you is, then you've got a diversity statement there. And I think it's something that's workable that you could submit to as a complement to that personal statement. What is an example of unnecessary information that may be left out of a personal statement? I don't know if unnecessary is the right word, right? I think there are things that, in terms of the things that you may want to consider whether or not it's an effective use of the real estate, I think that is probably going to be, anything that you can get elsewhere in the application, right? So, sort of recounting, the classes that you took, right, in undergrad, or talking about, hey, how great your grades were. Well, we see all of that, right? So if it's something that can be found easily, if it's something that can be found easily in other areas of the application, then I think it might be worth considering whether or not it is an appropriate use of the space to share that information in that personal statement. All right, so does the voice of the personal statement need to be more professional, like an essay, or can it be in my own voice, like a journal entry or letter to a personal friend? So this is a really good question, right? Because I think I started this off, right? And I've said multiple times that this is a professional writing piece and a professional writing exercise. I think that the tone can be professional and still also have personality, right? So if it is a journal entry, it can still be written professionally, right? Or a letter to a personal friend, it can still be written professionally. There are lots of ways to bring creativity to the process that don't make it any less professional. So I think it is, really about making sure that the writing is good, right? And I think when your writing is good and it's sound and it's a well-constructed letter, right, or personal statement, I think you give yourself the room to add a little whimsy to it, right, in terms of, approach and sort of the framework around it. Are there any overall themes you can point out in personal statements that make an applicant stand out? I think in terms of overall themes, like I've said before, I think it's really about communicating who you are and why you're here, right? I mean, if I can't come away from your personal statement with an understanding of those things, then what did I really learn about your, whether or not this is the right thing for you, right? What did I learn about your desire, to take on this very significant thing that is a lot of hard work, a lot of time, and a lot of energy. And I think that if you can craft a personal statement that communicates that, then I think that's the theme to prioritize, right? In terms of, sort of just, I guess in a more specific sense, like the kinds of themes that people will sort of spin out of personal statements. I think some of it is, I've always had an eye for justice, right? Or X thing happened and it helped me better understand what justice is, or I had Y experience, and that experience shaped me in these ways, and so now I want to go to law school, right? And those are some of the things that may pop out of a personal statement that help the committee understand, all right, this person's got good grades, right? They look prepared to do this academically, and they have a passion, right? They know why they're coming to do this, and they have a firm understanding of who they are, right, and what this is about for them. So another question: how do we effectively tell our story? I think that's that's like an existential question. How do we effectively tell our story? I think there's some of that's a little subjective, right? It's your story, so whether or not you're telling it effectively, I think is probably open to interpretation. I think what you have to ask yourself is, how do I clearly and concisely, right, put together a personal statement that captures what I want this committee to know about me to help support the decision that they are making, right? And again, if you are able to do that, then I think it's an effective use of the time and the energy. So how do I get started with my personal statement, and when should I start drafting my personal statement? I think you start drafting it whenever you get ready, right? It's not the kind of thing that you want to leave, to the last minute, right? I encourage students to be thoughtful about it. One, so that you can circulate it to people who can help you sort of frame it out and make sure that it makes sense and it's a good reflection of you. But two, just to give yourself time to edit it and really think about it and make sure that it is the story you want to tell to the admissions committee about you as it relates to, why you should be admitted to their law school. Now, I think to get started, if you don't have a prompt, if you don't know exactly what to say, I think that, like my earlier advice, just think about 2 or 3 things that the committee absolutely has to know about you in order to be able to make that informed choice about whether or not you're a good fit for their law school. And I think that if you start that way, you can build out a pretty good personal statement. Is there any piece of advice for non-traditional candidates that are changing careers? I think the advice that I would give to those who are sort of making that scope shift, the personal statement may give you an opportunity to share why you're doing it, right? Like, you did X thing for X number of years, so why are you pivoting here to pursue a career in the law and leave whatever it is that you're doing, right? To come take this on, right? And I think if you sort of treat the personal statement as an opportunity to tell that story, then I think you've got something usable and it should work. All right. So at the top of the personal statement, to identify myself just in case the pages are misplaced. So should I put identifying information on the personal statement just in case my personal statement is misplaced? You can, right? So we aren't using paper applications anymore. So the likelihood that that'll get mixed up enough, right, that we'll need to, sort of call you and say, hey, is this your personal statement, right? Because it's not identifiable, I think is a little lower than maybe it has been in the past. But if you want to use that kind of information and share it, you can absolutely do that. It never hurts anybody to put their personal information on it, just as a matter of course. All right, and so I'm going to move into our Q&A chat box now. Yeah, so how much information is too much? If someone had a health issue, particularly mental health, that affected their undergrad GPA, or does discussing that issue in a personal statement help or harm, or is it better to limit that to an addendum just in general? So I think that goes back to my earlier point, right? I mean, I think that you have to be wary of, being overly personal, but if there's a thing that has shaped who you are as a person and is driving your decision to pursue legal education, so long as you can frame it properly, I think you talk about it. If it's something that's really about your performance in undergrad, then I think it is an appropriate place for that to be like a GPA addendum, right? So if the plan was to spin your personal statement saying, hey, I had this issue and I overcame it, well, I think that that's probably more of a GPA addendum than it is a personal statement piece. So is it okay for my personal statement to touch on my relevant political beliefs? Well, Alexis, the first thing, I don't know what non-relevant political beliefs are, right? But I think that the political piece, again, you have to be thoughtful about it, right? Because you don't know who's reading the application, and sort of where they stand on things. And I don't believe that you would be negatively impacted necessarily in the application process by sharing those things, right? But not everybody is going to be on the same page as you. And so if you're going to talk about those political beliefs, I think you should be thinking about how you can connect it to your desire to take this step, right? So what does one thing have to do with the other? What does your political alignment have to do with your desire to pursue a legal education or go to law school? I think build some connective tissue there, then I think it can be effective. All right, so I've been working in the legal field for the past 4 years, including during my undergraduate experience, but including this experience makes me make this a good next step, or is this something that you would want to keep only in the, I want to provide. Okay, so if you've got some relevant legal experience that is informing your choice to pursue law school, I think you can talk about that, right? You can frame a personal statement around that. Hey, this experience has really sort of lit the fire under me to pursue legal education and to go this route. It's not the kind of thing that you would only have to keep in the resume, but if it is specific, if you've got things that happen or sort of some things about that experience that have really triggered or pushed you in this direction, then I think that makes a lot of sense. In this COVID climate, is Wayne State offering any virtual campus classes, or is the campus open for a regular on-campus attendance? Yes, we are offering remote classes, and that is absolutely an option for you. I've been told by a couple of lawyers that sealed, expunged charges do not need to be provided in any situation. Is this the case for law school application, or do these actually need to be provided? My advice is to err on the side of disclosure, because you don't want to bump your head. I don't want to tell you, what to do in that regard, right? But I think that if similarly situated, I would err on the side of disclosure, at least on the admission side. It's probably not going to mean that you don't get admitted to law school. I think people are worried that sharing this is going to mean that you don't get into law school. And I think the more important thing is you need to be thinking about what would happen if you got into law school and had not shared this and then have to share it with the state bar and have to answer for it. That's my advice to people, again, is to err on the side of disclosure. All right, so could we include personal stories in our essay about our experiences that have shaped us? I think, yeah. You want to be, if you've got a personal story or stories about experiences that you've had that have shaped who you are and how you do things the way you do things, or why you're pursuing legal education and taking on this step, I think it's a good use of that space and a good opportunity, again, for you to tell that story. If writing a personal statement about my military experience, would you also recommend writing a diversity statement as well? If both, what do you recommend in terms of separating the two? Well, I think that's a really good question, right? I mean, I think if there are things about your military experience that are driving you toward law school, then I think then using the personal statement to tell that story can matter, right? And I think the way that maybe you can separate the two, is, okay, my military experience is pushing me to go to law school, or these things happened in my military experience, and that's, why I want to go to law school. I think is personal statement stuff. And I think that if you're talking about it from a diversity statement standpoint, then it's, hey, my military experience, has me seeing the world this way, right? And this is what I bring to the table as a veteran, right? As somebody who served, here's what I bring to the table. Here's what's unique about me. So I think that if you're looking at it through those lenses, right, in terms of my military experience has driven me towards law school as the personal statement, and hey, this is what my military experience, how it shaped the way that I see the world, right, and the way that I'm going to show up in the classroom and what I bring to the table, and what makes me unique. I think that's more of a diversity statement piece. Should you be explicitly stating what type of law you are interested in? It's not an obligation to do that. If you have a particular area of law that's of interest to you, then feel free to sort of share that and put that in there. But if you don't, that's not a problem at all. My reason for law school is very cliche, social justice warrior, although it's true and is passionate about it. I know that story has been told too many times and I run the risk of not standing out. Well, I mean, if that's why you want to do this, what other story would you tell, right? I think that, people's concern is that, the personal statement has to jump out off the paper. Like if my personal statement isn't, sort of dancing across the table, right, and telling people to admit me that I won't get into law school, and it's just not that simple, right? I mean, it's not a universal solvent, right? It can make a strong application stronger, right? But I think that being worried that I'm just going to be another person in law school who wants to be, who's interested in social justice. Well, that's true of you, right? You'll be another person in law school who's interested in social justice, but you're uniquely you. So tell your story, why you want to do this, what's driving you towards this decision, and what your social justice warrior looks like, because it could look different than some other people's. So just think about making sure that it's your story. And you will stand out because you're you. There is only one you. There is not another you out there, despite what you may think. And even being sort of fitting into sort of what's, maybe a rising cultural norm doesn't mean that you can't be unique in that space. Did many 2020 students defer until 2021 because of COVID? If so, does that mean that Wayne will be more selective or have higher standards for applicants during this cycle? So we are not using what happened with COVID in 2020 to necessarily, say, hey, no, we're not going to admit people in 2021. We didn't have a ton of students defer because of COVID. I think that people sort of understood that this is the landscape we're going to be in, and it could be this way. And they wanted to go to law school, and they recognized that this was a good opportunity, and so they decided to join us. But what I will say is that it is harder to get into Wayne than it ever has been. That's just a reality, and that would be true COVID or no COVID, right? The standards, the expectations we have, at least in terms of targets and goals, are higher than they've ever been. I mean, we want a median 160 LSAT, a median 365 GPA, right? So, and those numbers, when students hear them, they're like, whoa, because it's different than maybe what you thought about Wayne or what you expected. And that's by virtue of the strength of applicants that we've received, right? And really our ability to really attract those kinds of students as a part of this process. So if I was subject to non-judicial punishment while in the military, should I disclose that information even though no one has access to those records except the DOD? Again, my advice is to err on the side of disclosure. It never hurts you to disclose the thing. It can hurt you if you don't disclose it and you find out on the back end that it's not necessarily what you thought it was, right? In terms of who has access to it. I've seen the state bars get access to stuff that nobody thought would be found because of what they're being asked to do as a part of this process. So not suggesting that it would be different than what you say, but I would rather you share what happened, right? And let that be in the record on your, on paper. And so if you do disclose it or don't have to disclose it, there's not an issue at all as it relates to that information coming out. So looks like I've exhausted the questions that are in the chat box. We've covered a lot of territory here today, and hopefully it's been good for you all. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Wizards of okay, I got one more question here. For someone who hasn't been an undergrad for at least 30 plus years, will Wayne accept the graduate grade point? We will absolutely accept it. The GPA that will be used to determine your admission will be your undergraduate GPA. It's just the way the process works. The way that this system works is that we use the undergraduate GPA. It may, for those of you who are, who've been away from undergrad, I think the understanding is that you're probably a little bit close, not that same student. So I would encourage you to think a lot about, pushing yourself really hard on the LSAT so that you can perform in that space and demonstrate the capacity there. So again, so we'll treat that as the last question. And I want to take this opportunity to thank my wizards behind the curtain. So Kaylee Place, our Director of Communications, and my wonderful colleague, Jill Burnett Maurice, our Graduate Outreach Specialist, and the 2017 Wayne Law alum. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We will absolutely be doing this again next week, same Wayne time, same Wayne channel. So be ready for more exciting content. And we thank you all for coming out and have a great night.